few shades of brown, love to share Brown's student talent, our many a cappella groups. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Brown University's 19th president, Christina Paxson.
Thank you, Sylvia, and I have a very small bit in this amazing program that is lined up for the next day or so. Good afternoon, and I'm really thrilled to welcome all of you who are here in person and virtually to this very, very special symposium honoring the lives and legacies of Lani Guinier and Bell Hooks. As we all know, two intellectual giants who challenged the status quo and fought to ensure that the voices of Black women were heard. So let me just begin by thanking Vice President Sylvia Carey Butler and her team in the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity, Nului Rooks in the Department of Africana Studies, and Spelman College's Women's Research and Resource Center for all the work they did in organizing this event, bringing together a fantastic group of speakers to honor these two remarkable women. So many of the scholars who you'll hear from over the next 2 days, they work with, they taught alongside, they learned from Lani Guinier and Bell Hooks. And it's just so wonderful to have them here to deepen our understanding of their work and the lasting contributions that they made to society. This symposium represents one of the many ways that Brown reaffirms our values as a community that first and foremost advances knowledge, welcomes diversity, respects human dignity. And there's so much to unpack about the work of both of these women, starting shortly with the President's panel. And we're really thrilled to be joined remotely by Brown President Emerita Ruth Simmons, who went on to lead Prairie View A&M University. And my friend RISD President, they're both my friends, but RISD President Crystal Williams, who will be introduced shortly by Brown Professor Prudence Carter, who is the Sarah and Joseph Dowling Professor of Sociology. And we'll hear much more about these two women who are at the center of this symposium. Just to set the stage very briefly, maybe all of you know this, you probably do, but Lani Guinier was a civil rights lawyer, the first woman of color to become a tenured Harvard law professor. And she pioneered research on implicit bias in the classroom and workplace. And she was at the forefront of upholding democracy and defending voting rights and challenging inequities in the system. Bell Hooks was a trailblazing author, poet, cultural critic, and social activist. And in her writing, she contested claims that feminism spoke for all women and said that some of what was then the status quo in feminism devalued the experiences of working class and Black women. And similarly, she saw the Black anti-racism movement as exclusionary to the experiences of Black women. And she called for recognizing differences as a way to create more inclusive movements. Now, I would say learning about these two women and thinking about what they did as a president, the central mission of any university, what are we here for? We're here to advance knowledge and understanding. And we can't do it without faculty, right? We need really we need students too, but you need faculty to go with those students. And as a president of a university, I expect our panelists on the president's panel, know that we can't fulfill this mission, our mission, without a faculty who are people who are intellectual risk takers, and people who are innovators, and people who have the courage to challenge the status quo, and who give us new frameworks for interpreting the societies in which we live, and giving us the imagination and courage to think about how the world could be better. And when I think about Lani Guinier and Bell Hooks, I think of them as exemplars of what's needed in academia, certainly, and I would like to have all of our students think about becoming like one of these two women. And they're also exemplars of what's needed in the world. So, my hope, again, is that as we deepen our understanding of these women's lives and their contributions, that we can inspire the next generation of intellectual powerhouses. And that's really the very best way to keep their legacies alive. So with that, let's turn it to the President's panel. So thank you. Prudence? Let's hope the technology works. Come on up. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone, or rather, good afternoon. Good afternoon. What a privilege and a pleasure it is for me to have the opportunity to engage with two of our nation's most esteemed higher education leaders, trailblazers, women who are committed to equity and racial and gender and social justice, Presidents Ruth J. Simmons and President Crystal Williams. I'm going to invite President Williams to the stage as I introduce her. And I will say a few words about her. It's been a pleasure getting to know her. She has just finished her first year, I believe, almost a year and a half now into her second year. Dr. Crystal Williams is Rhode Island's School of Design's 18th president. She brings more than 2 decades of higher education experience to RISD, an accomplished leader, collaborator, and community builder. President Williams has been an institutional catalyst, helping to envision, define, and achieve greater outcomes for students, faculty, and staff. President Williams began her career at Reed College, where she became a faculty activist, collaborating with colleagues to envision and catalyze a more inclusive and diverse institution. She moved on to similarly catalytic roles, and I like that word, as an organizational sociologist. She moved on to Bates College, then Boston University, where she also served in inaugural roles, first as an associate provost for diversity and inclusion, and then as a vice president and associate provost for community and inclusion. President Williams is an award-winning poet, an essayist, and she has published 4 collections of poems. She has been the recipient of numerous prestigious artistic fellowships and awards and grants and honors. At RISD, President Williams is helping to drive meaningful change centered on expanding inclusion, equity, and access to enhance a rich learning higher education environment. She is the proud daughter of an educator and a musician, was raised in Detroit, Michigan, and Madrid, Spain, and she holds degrees from New York University and Cornell University. Help me welcome President Crystal Williams to the stage. Our next speaker, and she really needs no introduction to Brown. She's no stranger, rather, to Brown, but I'm so happy to see her again. President Ruth J. Simmons. She currently serves as the president of Prairie View A&M University. When she steps down at the end of this month, Dr. Simmons will join Rice University as a distinguished fellow where she will serve with a variety of programs across campus and advise the president's office on myriad matters. In addition to collaborating with faculty and staff to build out programs for students to develop as future leaders at Rice, Dr. Simmons will, in addition, she will be collaborating with faculty and staff to build out programs. Now, as you know, Dr. Simmons served as president of Brown from 2001 to 2012. And under her leadership, Brown made significant strides in improving its standing as one of the world's finest research universities. She was a French professor before entering university administration. President Simmons held an appointment as a professor of comparative literature and Africana studies at Brown. And after completing her PhD in Romance languages and literatures at Harvard, she served in various faculty positions at the University of Southern California, Princeton, and Spelman College, before becoming president of Smith College, the largest women's college in the United States. That was a first for an American women's college. President Simmons is the recipient of so many honors that I think it would take me just a full hour to actually say them all, but let me just name a few. She's a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Council on Foreign Relations. She serves on multiple boards. She's also the recipient of numerous honorary degrees. She received Brown's faculty highest honor, the Susan Culver Rosenberger Medal in 2001. And in 2012, she was named a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. They both are badasses. Welcome, President Simmons. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever been introduced with that particular accolade, but thank you.
I just thought that I would keep it a little real, if I could. Use a little bit. President Williams and I were talking about integrating our authentic selves earlier. So, I didn't mean to be appropriate. I just wanted to say how illustrious you are. And that's the colloquial way we say it, where I come from. So I am so happy to get the conversation started. And in acknowledgement of the two intellectual giants we're honoring this weekend, Professors Lani Guinier and Bell Hooks, whose critical stances and penetrative gazes of society have influenced perhaps the majority of us in this room, and I would imagine it's influenced many of us of our generation. I'd like to start off by asking you this question, because I saw them and view them as moral authorities, as visionaries. And I would like you to start off by sharing a little bit of your own educational higher ed journey and the vision that motivates or has motivated and compelled you as you've taken that journey. So we'll start with you, President Simmons, and then move to you, President Williams.
Oh, I was hoping you'd start with Crystal, but hello, Crystal. Glad to be with you, even in this virtual format. First of all, thank you so much for honoring these iconic leaders who have shaped so many lives. I'm pleased to be a part of any program that acknowledges the importance of what they contributed to the advancement of the ideas that they raised. I guess I would say that there's one very deep motivation that I had for coming to this profession. And it was quite frankly that I grew up with lies, thankfully recognizable lies. So I was born in this country during deep segregation and under the weight of Jim Crow. And it was a system that taught us that we were worth nothing, that we could not aspire to higher order thinking, and that we should be content to live our lives under the boot of our oppressor, if I can put it that way. And I grew up understanding, because of the work of my parents and other people who influenced me, that obviously those were lies intended to keep people in control who were very jealous of the power that they held. And so my fight was to find a place where lies didn't have to be told. And when I walked into my first classroom and continued my path in education, I came to believe that education played a very special role in this country. It could be the place where lies were unmasked. It could be the place where we could find our way to our true selves, and not the ones that were being created by others in their interests. And so for me, the motivating factor has always been to keep higher education true to its mission, which is, as President Paxson said, to really provide for scholarship, to educate, to be enlightening to others. And I wanted to be a part of an effort that continued to do that. But part of my journey in higher education given the time that I entered higher education, which was right at the beginning of true integration, basically, of higher education in this country, I found that in part, the academy was also purveying those kinds of lies. So my journey has been to continue to work to unmask those lies, to continue to bring those from the margin into the center of academic life, and to continue to point out the inequities that continue to exist in our academic community.
Yeah, thank you. President Williams.
I, first of all, let me just say that we are living history right now, right? We've got Ruth Simmons and Evelyn Hammond, right? And Danielle Conway, who just became the president-elect of Mount Holyoke, Beverly Guy Sheftel in this room. So, and I start there with just a sense of deep humility. I am so moved to be here with these women who have made a way for us. And that we are in 2023, in this particular moment, in this particular room, with so many firsts still among us, is a travesty, a crime, and an honor, and a privilege, all at once. So we are in a complicated moment. So I just want to thank all of the people in this room who have really served to try to help make ours a better world. And I also want to say that we have framed so far, at least at lunch and so forth, we've been talking about the legacy of Lani Guinier and the legacy of Bell Hooks. And I think often, not necessarily in this context, but often in the larger context, we think about these two luminaries in relation to Black feminism, Black liberty, Black liberation, et cetera. And I would broaden to say that their impact is worldwide, that they have moved forward aggressively an agenda that is focused on equity, justice, feminism, right, et cetera, but that legacy is impactful across the globe and for all humankind. And so I want to just acknowledge the breadth and impact of women like Dr. Simmons, right, whose work really does free for everyone and open doors for everyone. So I just want to say that as a start. My journey to higher education and vision for being in higher education is much less laudable than what we heard from Dr. Simmons. I started my journey in higher education. I was telling President Paxson earlier, I was not convinced that higher education was a place I wanted to be, and so it took me a long time to get my undergrad degree. I thought not very much of the professors I had run into. I thought that the world had much more to teach me than a classroom did, and so it took me almost a decade to get my undergrad degree. And I think the moment, just to sort of pick up where Dr. Simmons sort of left off, the moment for me that really informed the work, some of the work, not all, but some of the work that I've since done in higher education was at Howard University. And I was in Dr. Olive Taylor's class. It was the first time that I had ever had a professor ask me to think. It was the first time that I'd had a professor say, I'm not interested in you regurgitating history. I know the history. I have a PhD. I need you to contextualize the information and be critical, right? And that was the moment I thought, well, wait a minute, something else is happening here that is actually of interest to me. And so if you fast forward, I became an assistant professor, and I was a third Black faculty member on tenure track at Reed College, and that was in 2000. And I looked around and I thought, and I was from Detroit, frankly. So, so this was, I mean, it was like literally the opposite of what I was accustomed to. And I just thought, this education these young people are getting at this small liberal arts college is extraordinary and incomplete. And we call ourselves a residential institution, and we say that what's important about residential institutions is the engagement with other people, and yet the engagement with other people had nothing at all to do with folks who were Black and brown, had nothing to do with folks who were LGBTQ or who were neurodiverse, et cetera. And that seemed a major failing and also an opportunity. And so what has driven my work in higher ed is the belief that education, to be truly educated, right, to be truly a person who thinks and does not accept the lies, and has information enough and skills enough to be able to pull together a way of thinking about something. To be truly educated does require that we have multiple kinds of people around the table. And that when you have multiple perspectives around the table, the knowledge that is generated at that table is fundamentally deeper, wiser, broader, better. It's a fundamental belief of mine. And so everything I've done in the academy has had to do with that. And I would say that correlated to that is that if you want people at the table, they have to be able to thrive, right? So it's both and. And that is the work that I have done. It's the work that I did as a faculty member around a table, we were talking about poetry. It's the work I did as a faculty activist. It's the work I do as a president. I think about who is at our table, who are the people who are in our studios, what are they learning, what are they learning from each other, and how is our art making our design, our knowledge better, bigger for the differences around the space that we inhabit.
Right. Thank you for that. So let's delve a little bit more into this greater democratic project of expansion, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, social justice. It's all complex. It has a progressive vision, but it's also rather messy. We can say it's very difficult also to operationalize, to implement, and we're now in this great period. It's not new because things get cyclical in American society where we've had some progression and now we have a political context of regression, pushback on diversity, equity, inclusion, pushback on the knowledge and frameworks that have been built, critical race theory, intersectionality. It is now illegal in some states to use Latinx, for example, or it's actually, so I'm curious as higher ed leaders, and okay, so that's one side, the part that's very much steeped in an ideology of white supremacy and structural racism. And there's another side also of our trying to bring together myriad perspectives, and they don't all coalesce at the table. And so you have incidents where one group is not offended, but another group could be offended, and faculty are caught in between. How do you address or think about this? And I'm particularly thinking about this young adjunct professor who was fired in Minnesota because she showed a picture of the Prophet Muhammad in her art history class. How do you grapple with these issues? What do you say? What do you do when the forces, they're the counter forces, and then they're the complicated, messy forces in doing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice?
Well, as you point out, it is indeed messy, but so is the alternative.
That's right.
And so one of the things that we love to do in the academy is, we're very high-minded and we're very complicated thinkers. One of the things we have to remember is that we're dealing with something so simple, so elegant, that we have to find ways to express that simplicity in all the complicated visual images that we see and all of the noise that we hear. And there is something so fundamental here that we have as people who love language and love to speak in nuanced fashion and love to speak with great complexity, that we're dealing with a very large segment of the population who do not relate to the way that we speak about our experience or about our tradition or about our way of thinking, and so forth. So I'll tell you some of the things that I have tried to do that have been periodically successful. And that is, I try first to control myself and not overly complicate matters that are beautifully simple.
Mm.
Freedom is a very simple, at its core, is a very simple principle. Freedom in the context of the vastness of humanity remains a simple concept, and that is that a human being is entitled to certain freedoms based just on the fact that they are a human being. Okay, and when individuals want to interfere with that freedom, they have to have very good reason. And so, yes, I don't have the freedom to drive in whatever way I want, although some people say I do. Um, there must be rules of the road to control the freedoms that people desire when they get behind the wheel of an automobile. But having said that, by and large, when it comes to matters related to the state and to organized societies, one basic principle is that everybody who is included in that state and in that society is entitled to fair and equitable treatment. They are entitled to be treated with dignity. They're entitled to be participants in the way in the way society is governed. Those are such basic tenets that I think it's possible for even the most simple-minded to understand how important those are and the extent to which they should govern in most of what we do. And I'm in a very complicated system right now, where I've got a board of regents that is very conservative. I've got a governor of the state that is well known for his ideas in these areas. I've got a legislature which must provide funding for the university that is opposed to so much of what we would be inclined to do as a university. That's the context in which I operate. So I'll just say as an example, the only way I can operate in this context is with clarity about what we do and why we do it, with clarity about why it's logical for us to do the things that we do as a university. And so on. So one example is that for some reason, when we invited the founder of Black Lives Matter to our campus, this was extraordinarily difficult for the state to accept. And naturally, they protested the fact that this person could be some kind of interlocutor in the context of an academic institution. And so they wanted, of course, to cancel our ability to make that decision. But being mindful of the circumstances that we're in, we always proceed with the assumption that not everybody will understand what we're doing. And so we had sought outside funding for that position precisely because we understood that those who hold the purse strings might not want this to occur. So I think to sum up, I think we have to, in this context, we have to be very practical about our path, and we have to be very realistic in understanding how this can be interpreted in so many different contexts. And if we want to advance, we must advance in a way that allows the story ultimately to be told and for reasonable people to understand. I'll give one more example. I promise I'll shut up. I was at Princeton and thinking about how we could advance advance diversity at Princeton, particularly on the faculty. And so I wanted Toni Morrison to be appointed at Princeton, but there was a hiccup. The search committee had its way of managing searches, which was perfectly legitimate in most circumstances, and that is to say, they wanted her to ask for appointment, to submit her materials before they would consider her. They would not consider her otherwise. When I approached Toni and I said, well, they need you to do this, her response was, well, if I have to do that, then Princeton is the wrong place for me because they obviously don't know my work. And why should I want to go to Princeton if they don't know and respect my work? Well, yes, that was one way of seeing it. The practical thing to do was for me to go and type up her resume and submit it to the committee, which is what I did. These things are so crucial. We cannot be held back by these kinds of smallness of what is preventing progress. We simply can't be. And so, so both in trying to articulate with clarity our purpose and our very generous vision for humanity, we have to also be prepared to act in ways that acknowledge the corruption of what we're working against. And so if you know that you have conservatives that will not permit you on a place where Sandra Bland was apprehended and which led to her death, if you know about that and you know how vital it is for our students to hear from people who have led Black Lives Matter, if you know that, well, you have to find alternative means, but you can't stop bringing the truth to the fore just because people are going to oppose it.
Well, thank you for that.
I would say that Howard Thurman, there's a quote, I'm going to paraphrase, something he told his daughters. I think the measure of the power of a people is the extent by which people will try to oppress them. And I think about that idea in relation to where we are as a country and the push that we're seeing, the very aggressive push against DEI efforts, DEI offices, critical race theory. People have lost perspective and are corrupting the actual work for their own political purposes. And why are they doing that? Why is this so acute at this particular moment? And it's because we have moved the bar further down the line, further than it's ever been. And that is a fundamental threat to power. And so I think that it's important. I think about that all of the time. So I put that to the side. I think what I would say is, wait, what was the question?
You're answering it.
Okay.
Keep going. Keep going.
The way I think about this work, that we are in such a complex moment. The work is complex, right? And we have been, as a society, particularly in this country, trained to pit one group against another group. It's a very effective strategy. And we also are operating with very distinct generational differences. And so the way my students interpret something is almost the exact opposite than the way I interpret something. Here, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was at a small liberal arts college. There had been some activism by a group of largely black students, but their allies as well. And at that point, there was an app that was a geolocated anonymous app called Yik Yak. And so what that meant was that if you were within a mile of that location, you could go on the Yik Yak and say whatever you wanted to say. And so as a result of the activism, the students went on to Yik Yak and decided to have a conversation about race. Well, so that's never a good idea, to have a conversation about race on an app that is anonymous. Right, so somebody said on the app something that was, wanting to own slaves, et cetera, et cetera. That day, I had a series of black students actually coming into my office in tears, et cetera. If you fast forward, and they were in tears because the idea that someone with whom they were interacting on a daily basis, eating, could want to own them was troubling, right? It was beyond troubling, it was distressing. So fast forward, I was in the cafeteria and talking with some students. I had a particularly bright student, really, I think he's probably a genius, this young man. And and I was talking to him, I wanted to talk with he and his friends about race and so forth, and I said, well, what do you think about race here at this school or whatever? And he says, well, I've been oppressed here. So that's a powerful word. And so I said, well, wait a minute. Hey, you've been oppressed. Where have you been oppressed and how? We need to get this straight. And he said, well, I was oppressed when, now this is really a very brilliant young man. He said, I was oppressed when someone went on Yik Yak and said they wanted to own slaves. And so I said to him, I wonder if we're having a definitional problem. How do you define oppression? And his definition of oppression was what I interpreted to be discomfort. Now, there is a philosophical way of understanding oppression and discomfort as being related, right? But legally, you wouldn't say something that, right? So I said, well, my definition of oppression is systemic, a blah-de-blah-de-blah, and I went down. And he looked at me and he said, no, that sounds right. We'll go with your definition. And so he said, so I said, so what I took away from that, and that moment will always sort of stay with me, right? Because I realized, and I said, well, why did you use that language? And he said, because it's the language that's been available to me. So that was an indictment, I understood, of us as educators. And those of us who are parents, I am not, but those of us who are parents who have not given perhaps some of our young people the tools to distinguish between what makes us uncomfortable and what actually is a structural barrier. Right? And so then when you think about the complexities of the world of higher education and the diversity in that world, you've got folks who have one definition of oppression, and you've got other folks who define things that are simply making them uncomfortable. And that makes the example that you just provided us fraught. Because I wonder if what was happening in that classroom actually was just discomfort. Right? Or distaste for. And the goal of education is not to make people feel comfortable. The goal of education is to make people be more knowledgeable and acquire the skills that allow you to then perpetuate self-knowledge and knowledge of others and the world. Those are the goals. It is not to make you feel good. I don't have you come into my classroom and say, well, I want you to make you feel good. So when you give me your poem to read, I'm going to say it's a great poem when it's a terrible poem. I'm not going to do that, right? So I just think that the complexity that we're dealing with is, and that gets conflated. The complexities get conflated. And then you have many, many, many peers, both presidents and on, who themselves they're not content experts, right? And they don't perhaps have the skills to deal with these complexities, and they may not even have infrastructure around them, people with whom they can speak about how to deal with this effectively. And sometimes it's as simple as bringing the groups into a conversation. Because I have found that when I talk with someone and mirror back and say, this is what I've heard, is that what you mean? Well, no, actually, that's not what I mean. Well, what do you mean? And so then we get to discomfort. So, but you have to have the inclination and skill set to do that. And so I just think that we're in this very difficult moment, and if we don't get ourselves straight, that is, if leaders don't get some skills and some understanding about how to deal with these complex moments, legislatures and very folks who are conservative and not thinking about actually education, but thinking about political wins, will win if we want to characterize this as a war of some sort, right, or as a disagreement. Does that?
Yeah, it feels spot on, and I appreciate your differentiating between, and first of all, you also gave the definition of what it means to be a good communicator, just listening to you. I mean, my therapist tells me that's what you're supposed to do, right? Like, wait a minute, slow down.
Slow
right?
down.
Slow down and ask the question. So I appreciate that you're also, it's about how to communicate and get people to figure out how to be in community with each other, particularly
exactly
if we
right.
go and have these diverse educational environments. So, and I appreciate that kind of the definition of what oppression is, of what structural problems are. And I want to back up a moment because in a few months, the Supreme Court, which has an overwhelmingly majority, a conservative majority, is likely going to strike down affirmative action. Very likely. And I can imagine that higher ed leaders across the nation are trying to grapple with how to staunch or mitigate the adverse impact of this decision. And I wonder if you could share with us how you've been thinking about this, because there's the kind of the secondary or corollary issues around culture and ethos and getting along, but first we got to be inside the door. And so I really am wondering what are you thinking? What would you say? What is coming out of your collaborations and networks, if you were willing to share something?
I don't know that I have any specifics. We at RISD have been thinking about this for the last, year and a half or so. And some of the systems that we have used over the course of years, we'd already begun changing and shifting for a host of reasons, including broadening access, et cetera. I have been struck by, and this is not the question you asked necessarily, and I'm eager to hear Dr. Simmons's answer to the specific question, but I have been struck by the relative silence in higher ed about affirmative action being in the courts. And I don't know if that's because of the niche that I'm sort of in as an art and design school. We've got a law school dean here. I don't know what is actually happening. I'm accustomed to amicus briefs going, people sort of, I am troubled by, and this is related to the last question you asked, I'm troubled by the lack of public engagement by higher ed on these topics broadly. And I don't know if it's that people sort of don't understand the severity of the threat. I'm not in public school spaces, so I don't know what those conversations are necessarily. I know that there have been strategies to shift conversations from race, for instance, to first gen, or race to low income, right? But that really has to do with diminishing the import of race publicly, even if it's not on the ground, right, translating. And what I mean by that is, as a diversity, like someone who's done diversity in higher ed, I know that there are certain communities I can go to and I can talk about first gen and what, right, the analog between, like the correlation between first gen communities and BIPOC communities is quite strong. So I'm talking about both often. It's not an absolute correlation, but there's a strong. I know that, but I know if I go into that room and talk about first gen, I'm going to get our movement further down the line than I'm going to if I just go in talking just about race. So I don't know where higher ed is. I don't know where our peers are. Dr. Simmons, do you know where our peers are on this? Because no one's talking to me about it.
Well, first of all, let me avow that I was the expert witness in the Harvard trial that brought
Ah.
this to the Supreme Court. And so the build up to that took a good deal of work and effort to try to mount a case. By the way, a case that we knew would go ultimately to the Supreme Court. But why? Because the time is right for it. We knew that. This warning has been coming for 2 decades that there would be an end to affirmative action as a policy, as public policy. And there would be an end to it because of the first phase where it was narrowly tailored. Um, uh, One could imagine that that narrow tailoring of affirmative action would, of course, result in the elimination of affirmative action. Let's understand that we're talking at odds here because we are bringing political fight to a discussion of principles and educational theories, and it is not the same thing. This is a political fight, which is to end practices wherein African Americans in particular, and minorities and women as well, have any kind of advantage in the selection process for the limited goodies that there are to give out in society. Okay, so that's what this is about. But keep in mind that the political approach that was taken was to use Asian Americans as that wedge. And so the Supreme Court case is brought by a minority against the practice so that African Americans will not be privileged and Americans will not be at any disadvantage because of any privilege given to African Americans. But that's a perfect way to speak about the reality of what we're dealing with. Okay, highly organized efforts, political efforts, funded, well funded, well planned over a very significant period of time. So much so as to get the right people in place when the vote was going to come up. So much so as to make sure that it didn't go in as a case of white males complaining about the loss of privilege, but rather as Asian Americans complaining about the way that they were being discriminated in Harvard admission. So I'll go back to my original point: is that we to be successful in this war that we're in, we have to remember that our well-honed, sophisticated arguments are not going to be that effective. So I would invite anybody, the smartest person I could find, to interact with the actors here on the ground in Texas who are organized to do this work and think that they're going to come out having changed their perspective at all. That's not going to happen. So what is needed from us in this moment, given the fact that political sides are quite hardened? What is needed from us? And I'll go back to what I said before. What's needed from us is to promote the simple, the most straightforward arguments about why it is that this is important. Okay. And I must say, when I was on the stand at the Harvard trial, I completely lost it when I was being cross-examined because the attorney asked to me a very stupid question, and that is, he wanted to know why on earth in this day and age would we need anything like diversity? Why? And suddenly, what flooded into my mind was the shooting that had occurred shortly before in a synagogue. And I just started crying because I'm greeted with a stupid question as to things are wonderful in this country. Why would we need diversity? So my simple answer to his question when I could compose myself was because if we don't have the capacity to come together, to understand each other, to look across difference, to work across differences of opinions and differences of background and so forth, what would become of us? That's what it comes down to. And for me, the more we can talk about the necessity of being able to work together, to formulate a future together, the more it's going to be apparent to people who are more politically engaged that their efforts will inevitably end up in a cul-de-sac and a tragic one at that. So I like the simpler arguments just because of probably the people I'm dealing with here, and the fact that it is so outrageously political that there is no argument that will help. Now, as to what we're doing on the in universities, I'm not as frightened as some about the end of affirmative action as we know it. And I'm not because of my age, I suppose. And that is because I believe that some public policy will proceed from what we've been using in the past to improve our diversity. We don't know what that is yet, but you can be sure that something is going to be produced that is the successor policy to affirmative action. And it's going to happen because there are enough people who do get it that they will turn their attention immediately to trying to formulate something that will make it work better. That's what I believe.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I'm listening to you talk about being practical and keeping it simple. And I'm also hearing at the moment Professor Lani Guinier from The Tyranny of Meritocracy echoing my brain right now about the specter of these test scores that we have used to signify merit. And she was an advocate for getting rid of this testocracy that really has wrapped us up in this conundrum that we're in. And I'm just going to ask point blank, would it be practical to no longer rely on these standardized tests, which are nearly like point something, almost 100%, but 0.8, high correlation to socioeconomic background? And to no longer use those, but to use what she argued was a wider repertoire of qualities and traits of individuals that show signs of those who could be contributors to our democracy, to building the democratic project. So is that a practical one?
Well, we're already doing that. As you know, many institutions have moved in that direction already. Whether or not we'll get there with all major institutions, frankly, I don't know. But keep in mind, whenever you have a limited, well, I'm not an economist, but whenever you have a limited supply, you're going to have a perennial problem of how you make those selections, okay? And if there are so few places at Brown, that most of the people applying will never be able to get in, then how are you going to make the selection in a way that people will understand and accept? Okay, that's the problem. And the reason people have gone to quantified data is that it's lazy. It's true. It's lazy. It's an easy way to make selections and then to report to people why you have made those selections. When you start to go to something different on many different traits, it then becomes harder for you to report to your constituencies that you are being fair. because they no longer understand. That's why the Harvard case is important, because statistically, Asian Americans do better on certain indices than other groups, including whites, right? And so, why shouldn't they be the majority of students, for example, at Harvard, and so on? So I don't know how you can develop a full enough array of data points to make people feel better about the decisions being made, but something will undoubtedly be developed. And as I say, many universities have already gone in that direction and eliminated test scores from consideration in admission.
Right.
And we've gone to test optional. I inherited that. We just pulled out of U.S. News and World Report because so many of the metrics that they use have strong correlations to inequitable systems, et cetera. So I think that that's right, and there are more and more institutions every day who are going test optional, et cetera.
So scaling it. Let me pivot for a moment and invoke the spirit of Bell Hooks and Lonnie Grenier, who both in their writings talked about the double, triple, quadruple whammies or jeopardies. Certainly if we think about this from the perspective of race and gender, class, and thinking about the intersections of those in being Black women leaders in the academy, and what your journey has been like, both in some ways being a part of a very small class that's burgeoning, it's growing, it's nice to see that it is growing, but this is also a space that could use some wider representation, obviously. But I wonder if you could share with us what it's like, to the extent that it's where you have to grapple how you navigate your Blackness and your being women, steeped in a system of, white supremacy, patriarchy, sexism, people not having a heart, wanting to be subordinate possibly to you. Perhaps you've had white male colleagues who didn't want to be deferential. Perhaps you've had Black female colleagues who didn't want to be deferential. I wonder if you could talk about that and what the journey has been like in terms of your own social identity. Or perhaps it's not been, I would find that hard to believe, but I'd be curious what you could share with us. Certainly because this was something that they both also argued about, and there were consequences in their own careers, right? Yeah.
After your first question, and I sort of talked a bit about the importance of Ruth Simmons in the culture and imagination of both the academy and the country, it would be hard to understate what Ruth's leadership and representation has meant to so many of us. I don't know the names of big ships. And I was going to say the Titanic, and I realized that's that's wrong. But if you could imagine the largest ship, right, in the world, in the ocean, and then the rest of us coming along behind. That is what. Right? I was talking to young people, a group of young leaders of color here in Providence the other day, and this question comes up. I have a very high tolerance level for micro and macro aggressions. It has to do with my own upbringing, et cetera. And it also has to do with the fact that I understand these things to be the manifestation of a disease that is not mine. Yeah. Right? So I don't take those aggressions into my body. I have to strategize and navigate them if they are in my way enough, or if they are in the way of others enough. And that has been a thing that I have learned to wield as a skill and as a leadership trait. That is to say, You know, years ago I had a white dean of faculty and a president, both white men. The president pulled me into to his room and he said, well, the dean of faculty is worried about like how aggressive you are about blah, blah, blah. Right, well, okay, so black women aggression, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a trite trope, I mean, it's, you know. And so I normally would not have even given it really much purchase, except for I needed to work with him, and I could see that that would be in my way, right, if I didn't like navigate that. So I thought about it some, and I went back to the dean of faculty, and I said to him, listen, I want to talk with you about my communication style. I am a black woman from Detroit, Michigan. You're not going to run into very many more people who are as direct as black women from Detroit, Michigan. It is not aggression, it's not anger, it is simply directness. So understand, when I'm saying to you, there's nothing else there. And he looked at me, he said, oh, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry, you know. And I went to the president and had to say to him, look, I went and talked to him, we're good, are we good? And he said, yeah. And so, you know, I've as a black woman, I've had to navigate in those ways. I have been, unlike many of my peers, in spaces that call me to fully inhabit blackness, gender, etc., as a means by which to get my work done. So my experience is different in the academy. I will also say, I said to that young group of people, somebody was asking me about self-care, and I said, I surprised myself, I said, one of the things that I do as a principal way of caring for myself is I show up fully and 100%. I don't code switch anymore. I used to. I used to expend a lot of energy figuring out how am I going to be over in this space, how am I going to be in this space. I have a cap and a t-shirt at home that I got off of one of those Facebook ads, and it says, be you, they'll adjust.
I want that.
And I swear, like when, like, right, like that is, it's an invisible little cloak. And so when you're talking to me, understand, be you, they'll adjust. And if you can't adjust, I understand that to be really your problem unless I am being egregious and disrespectful, et cetera. Otherwise, but I recognize that I have that kind of freedom and that kind of power because I stand behind people like Dr. Simmons. Right? I understand there to be a direct line between my freedom and their work. Yeah. And I also know now, as the first black president of RISD, which didn't mean anything until I came up with a mask. I thought I was incognito, and this group of young women came up to me and they were like, are you President When I didn't understand what it meant for me to be here until I saw them. And what it means is what she means, right? So I'll stop, because I know Dr. Simmons has.
President Simmons.
Well, I had a mother who had an 8th grade education and who never really knew freedom. But she was very wise. And she reared her children with, again, some very simple principles. And that is, you're a human being, accord to other human beings the respect that you want. Be proud of yourself and do not depend on the approbation of others. Work to become the person that you want to be and that you approve of. And so I would say from the beginning of my, well, really, starting with my time at Harvard, I was in a cocoon, and that cocoon was shaped by the teachings of my mother, which was I had to be within myself, comfortable with who I was and what I was doing, and then not worry about all the noise surrounding me. Back in May, Harvard invited me back to a special ceremony for the classes of 20 and 21 because I had been the commencement speaker for that last class. And they decided to read a very fancy citation at the ceremony about what I had done in my life. And I'm standing on Tercentenary Theater, in Tercentenary Theater, looking out over, I don't know, tens of thousands of people. And I'm hearing the president of Harvard read this citation, but what I'm seeing out in front of me is the girl that I was wandering around that space with the understanding that nobody thought I belonged there. They thought I was odd. The faculty thought I would never get a job in the academic world because after all, what was a Black girl from the South doing, taking a PhD in Romance languages and literatures? Who would accept me for that? Okay. So from the very beginning, I couldn't make my way in the world by thinking of myself as a girl or as Black or as some other confection that others created for me. I knew I had to create that for myself, and I fought for that at every turn. But I also fought for the ability to learn, to be more magnanimous in my thinking, to learn not to do the things that people had done to me. And so gradually I came to be a person who was more open, who was more solicitous of others' views, who was more inclined to not overreact when people obviously showed that they didn't think I was all that, and so forth. But I will also say that to me, the problem was not exclusively uh, uh, among whites, it was also among Blacks. When I was appointed president of Brown, I was the wrong person to become the first president of an Ivy League university. That person was supposed to be pristinely prepared so that there would be no embarrassment to the Black community. So I went to an HBCU. I was from a small town in Texas. I was one of the faculty at Brown said, she's a Baptist. I was a Baptist. And so here I come, this person who doesn't not have the veneer of a polished Ivy League person who naturally steps into the spotlight and becomes the president of Brown. I was something else. And then I had the audacity early in my presidency to say, let's tell the truth about slavery in Brown. Oh my God. My very good friend, Nellie McKay, brilliant scholar, called me alarmed. She said, girl, have you lost your mind?
Yeah.
Well, I hadn't lost my mind, it turns out. I was just holding to the same principle that brought me to the academy, and that is universities should be the last places to harbor lies. And so if we are not about telling the truth, how can anyone trust what we do as educators? And that seemed a simple truth to me. And therefore, I thought it would be a good thing to do this. Did I think that I would be crucified for it? Yes, probably. But it didn't matter because that cocoon that nurtured me all those years coming through educational institutions was going to protect me from being hard on myself. And so that's what I say to all who have the capacity to lead and who desire to lead. You have to know who you are before you step into that spotlight, because you can be driven to do unseemly things for the approval of others. and you will never be a good leader that way. And I've survived some pretty difficult situations. I've had the regard of the faculty. I've had the regard of my students. I've been the happiest person I know in regard to the satisfaction I have with my work. But it's because every day that I come to work, I come committed to do what I think is best for my students and for the institution that I serve. And because I do that, then I don't worry about whether somebody thinks that I should be over them or not. I mean, to me, that's not what it's about.
Wow. Thank you both. Wow. Now that deserves an applause, right? So we have a few moments to open it up to the audience and to see if there are questions. We can take a few questions now from the audience. Let's see who has a question for Presidents Williams and Simmons. Don't be shy, because I have more. Yes, go ahead. Is that Professor Rose? Yes.
Yeah, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
There was while we were discussing things, you were talking about generational differences.
Yes.
And one thing that struck me, now I'm just a dumb engineer. This is what I do. But one of the things that strikes me is that sometimes very subtle things can lead to macroscopic properties. And what I mean by that is that the feeling of oppression versus de jure oppression can have the same effect. It can shunt people away from certain things and toward others. So I'm just wondering if that kind of fits into the bigger worldview of how we tackle these problems, because it could be the subtle things, some of the subtle things, that actually generate the largest movement. And that's a hypothesis from a dumb engineer.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I certainly agree that the subtleties of the spirit can aggregate in ways and move us to the left, to the right, I mean, I don't mean that politically, but I just mean, right, that the way you feel. So we see some of this in post-COVID. We hear from communities of color, for instance, that they actually prefer to work from home because they're not experiencing on a day-to-day basis in the office the kinds of small exclusions that they experience, right, in person. And so they want to work from home. That catapults into a movement. And I'm sort of, so I think I agree with that. I would just add to, so I'm not actually adding anything or answering, I think I agree with that. I would say, however, that one of the things I think it is important for all of us, particularly those of us who are in the academy and teaching, to help young people understand is that humility and compassion and curiosity are not nice things to have, right? They are requirements, I think, for a life that is fulfilling, meaningful, and a life that is able to engage effectively with a broad diversity of people. And that's because, and I said this in my convocation speech this year to our incoming class, and I sort of simplified it, but essentially I was talking about my uncle, who, was born in 1936. And if you think about the incredible cultural change that man has experienced, there was no Latin A, there was no LGBTQ, there was no love meets love. None of that existed out in the public sphere. He has a habit that is in my family, and it is, sweetheart, I don't understand your thinking. How have you come to think like that? And he rots that question is sincere, and it is asked all of the time. And so what I was saying to the young people was, listen, you may think you know A, B, and C, and you can get in your feelings about somebody not knowing A, B, and C. The question is, do you know D, E, F? And should they get in their feelings about you not knowing D, E, F? So in other words, if you approach other people with humility and compassion and curiosity, what we all don't know, right, becomes less a weapon and a mallet and more a bridge across which we find each other. So that was not the question you asked, but that's the answer I have.
But the nuance in your and understanding, unpacking that complexity from the subtlety to the macroscopic in your I think that you did answer the question in some ways, right? I would agree. President Simmons, do you have anything you would like to add?
No, I think that was very well put, and speaks powerfully to the tremendous responsibilities we have as educators. I like to remind faculty and anybody who has the responsibility for shaping young people that they have to work on themselves first.
Yes, that's it.
It bears noting that we are not in a position to tell other people who they should be and how they should react. If we have not put in the hard work ourselves of developing that humility, that understanding, that intense interest in the collective well-being of the world, if we haven't done that work, how dare we try to preach to people about what solutions we should find? And so to me, every day is an effort to to do that work. I recently decided that I would resign my position here, which was very hard for me to do because, so much of the joy of these positions is about our students, and I'm looking forward to graduation and giving them a hug and taking photographs with them, and they're all the best part of the year is coming up. But then I had a choice. I had a choice as to whether or not to accept what I thought was a um, very disparaging decision, disparaging for our university and disparaging for us generally as a people. I had a choice between accepting that decision and enjoying my students in May, or I could show my students what it was like to live a life that was well integrated with your values. And I chose the latter. And so I sent a letter to my students explaining how I felt about this decision that I made and giving them advice about how it is possible to move through life, protecting your convictions, acting in the interest of justice, and being able to accept who you are, fully who you are, even in the moments of greatest challenge. And so I think that's the work we do on ourselves. What are we willing to do? How far are we willing to go in the service of our values and our principles? That's so often what people miss, that people are watching that. Okay. And I'm more surprised than anybody else at the people who have been watching me and telling me years later some small thing I did affected them in some major way. But everybody who is at this conference has to be aware of the fact that they are being watched. They are being assessed constantly as to whether or not there is any kind of really meaningful belief in what we are doing, what people see us doing. I want always people to see that whatever I do, I have a profound belief in the rectitude of what I'm doing. And so, going back to this question, what ultimate effect would those kinds of things have on people? Well, yes, obviously it would have an effect on them, but that is really not the question. The question is, what are we prepared to do in this struggle that will help to lighten the load for those students? Because for me, it's what we do in our actions that lighten that load for them. I remember a student walking along the path at Smith, and she was hobbled by a crutch because she had broken her leg, and she was going up the hill. So I stopped my car and said, "Get in. I'm going to take you where you need to go." And she said, to my horror, "No, President Simmons, if you can do what you've done, given what you've endured, I can get up this hill on this crutch." Now that's a preposterous thing, I know. But even so, that's the way the people who look at you interpret what you're doing as a model for what they can do. So what we're trying to impart is it is possible to live a life of dignity and courage, um, uh, because that is not only meaningful to you, but it's meaningful to all of those people who are getting slights every day to see what you're doing and to be able to emulate it.
My Lord, thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. You, first applause. Yeah. Thank you. You know, I could go on and on, but we have come to the end of our time together, and I can only say that the two of you today have exemplified for me what it truly means to be a transformative leader. A transformative leader. And thank you for lifting up the notions of being, first of all, true to yourself and your principles, but being authentic and integrated. Like, those are the lessons that I think many of us can take together, and that they all, when they come together, you can weather any organizational and institutional storm. So I am grateful on behalf of the organizing committee. I'm sure we're all grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.